may have noticed it without ever naming it. A moment where everything should move forward, yet doesn't. Not because you failed, not because the conditions were wrong, but because something subtle intervened. It feels like an invisible resistance, a quiet counterforce that engages precisely when alignment seems closest. You prepare, you focus, you do what appears correct, and still the motion stalls. This sensation is not random. It follows a pattern. You can feel it in the body before it becomes a thought, a tightening, a hesitation, a delay in breath. The system pauses itself as if an internal regulator has decided that acceleration would destabilize something deeper. You might have interpreted this as self-doubt, procrastination, or a lack of discipline, but those labels never quite explained the precision of the timing. The resistance activates only when the signal strengthens. This is the detail most people miss. The brake does not engage when you are lost or unfocused. It engages when coherence begins to form, when intention sharpens, when the observer inside you starts aligning with a different trajectory. At that moment, something within you applies pressure, not aggressively, not dramatically, but enough to slow the shift. You did not install this consciously, and it is not malfunctioning. Every complex system has a stabilizer. When change approaches faster than integration allows, regulation occurs. Not as punishment, as protection. The subconscious does not distinguish between opportunity and threat. It only detects deviation from what has been stable. So when a new timeline approaches one that requires a different identity, rhythm, or internal structure, the system reacts. Not to reject the future, but to preserve coherence in the present. This is why effort alone never resolved it. Effort increases signal amplitude. The brake responds proportionally. You may have felt frustrated by this, confused, even betrayed by your own mind. But the sensation you call sabotage is not opposition. It is a detection mechanism responding to an anomaly in familiar patterns. Nothing has gone wrong. The moment you recognize this, the field shifts slightly. Not outwardly, inwardly. Recognition reduces noise. The nervous system stops interpreting the pause as danger. Stillness replaces urgency. And in that stillness, the brake begins to loosen, not because it was forced to, but because the condition that required it is dissolving. You are not being blocked, you are being regulated. And regulation, once seen, clearly no longer needs to be rigid. Stay with that awareness. Nothing else is required. You may have assumed that resistance appears because something is wrong with your desire, that wanting more somehow destabilizes you. But notice how selective the resistance has always been. It does not appear when you imagine casually. It does not appear when you daydream without consequence. It appears when the signal becomes believable. That distinction matters. The subconscious system you carry does not respond to language or logic. It responds to probability. When an imagined future crosses an internal threshold, from abstract possibility into perceived reality, the system reacts, not emotionally, structurally, as if a previously theoretical shift has suddenly become operational. This is where the brake engages, not because the future is impossible, but because it is close enough to require reorganization. And reorganization demands energy, identity, recalibration, and uncertainty. The system evaluates all of that in milliseconds, far below conscious awareness. You feel only the result, a drag, a dullness, a sudden loss of clarity. It can feel like motivation evaporates for no reason, or that confidence drains at the exact wrong moment. But this is not collapse, it is containment. The system narrowing the signal to prevent overload. You may notice how this containment disguises itself as rational thought. This isn't the right time. Something feels off. I should wait. Those thoughts are not lies, they are translations. The conscious mind attempting to narrate a physiological regulation response. But when taken literally, they mislead you into thinking the brake is wisdom or warning rather than a neutral stabilizing function. This is why the experience feels confusing. It carries authority without clarity. The system is not asking you to stop. It is asking you to slow enough to integrate. Integration is the word rarely used here. Most people try to override resistance by increasing intensity, more visualization, more effort, more discipline. That only amplifies the signal disparity. The subconscious senses acceleration without structural support and applies more braking force. A loop forms. You push. It slows. You interpret slowing as failure. You push harder. The field tightens. But consider this: what if the brake only exists because the signal arrived faster than the body could stabilize it? What if the system is not rejecting the future, but insisting on coherence before transition? When you view it this way, the sensation changes. The resistance no longer feels hostile. It feels procedural, almost impersonal, like a safety protocol engaging during a systems upgrade. You are not meant to fight safety protocols. You are meant to meet them with awareness. The moment awareness replaces urgency, the system recalibrates, not instantly, gradually. It begins to trust that the observer is present enough to witness change without destabilization. You may notice this as a subtle settling. The breath deepens without effort. The chest softens. Thoughts slow, not because you force them to, but because they no longer need to compensate for internal pressure. This is coherence forming. Coherence is not excitement. It is alignment across layers. When coherence increases, the brake does not disappear dramatically. It simply stops being necessary, like a hand easing off a lever once the system no longer threatens imbalance. This is why nothing dramatic needs to happen here. No declaration, no decision, no leap. The work is not in movement, it is in recognition. You are allowed to acknowledge that the resistance made sense, that it protected something fragile, that it kept timelines from fragmenting when identity was not yet ready to shift. That acknowledgement alone reduces friction. You do not need to convince yourself of anything. Convincing is another form of force. The system does not respond to persuasion. It responds to safety. Safety is communicated through stillness, through the absence of demand, through your willingness to remain present without requiring immediate results. When you allow that, the brake loosens incrementally, not as a reward, as a natural consequence of restored equilibrium. You are not waiting anymore. You are stabilizing. And stabilization is movement at a depth most people never sense. There is a reason the brake feels so personal. It activates at the level where identity and survival overlap, not physical survival, pattern survival. Every system maintains continuity by preserving what has been predictable. The subconscious measures safety by familiarity, not by outcome. So when a new trajectory begins to form, one that requires you to act, think, or perceive yourself differently, the system flags it as an anomaly. An anomaly is not a threat. It is simply unverified. You can feel this in how the resistance often carries emotional color without a clear story. A low-grade unease, a sense of exposure, the feeling that stepping forward would make something visible that has remained protected by repetition. This is not fear of failure, it is fear of incoherence. Incoherence occurs when behavior changes faster than self-concept. The system avoids that at all costs. You may notice how the brake activates most strongly when the shift would require you to be seen differently by others or by yourself. When the timeline ahead demands a recalibration of worth, capacity, or authority, the subconscious does not argue, it regulates. This is why logic rarely dissolves the sensation. You can list evidence, rehearse reasons, remind yourself of past success. The brake does not respond. It is not evaluating truth, it is monitoring structural stability. Think of it as a gate that opens only when internal signals align across layers. Thought alone is insufficient. Emotion alone is insufficient. There must be resonance between intention identity and nervous system readiness. Until then, the gate remains partially closed, not locked, buffered. This buffering can feel like numbness, like disinterest where passion used to be, or like distraction suddenly dominating attention. These are not distractions at all. They are pressure valves, ways the system disperses excess signal when integration lags. Most people interpret this as loss. It is actually regulation. The moment you stop pathologizing the sensation, its grip softens. The system no longer needs to mask its function. The observer inside you recognizes the pattern rather than reacting to it. Recognition creates space. In that space, something subtle happens. The system begins to test micro-adjustments, small allowances, fleeting moments where clarity returns then recedes. These are not fluctuations, they are calibration pulses. You may notice them as brief windows where movement feels possible without strain, moments where the idea of acting no longer triggers contraction. These windows appear and disappear without your control. They are not meant to be seized. They are feedback. The system is asking one quiet question: can this state be maintained without destabilization? If you rush to act the moment the window opens, the brake re-engages, not out of punishment, out of caution. The system has not yet confirmed stability. This is where patience stops being a virtue and becomes a structural requirement. Not patience as waiting, patience as allowing signals to settle long enough to be trusted. You are not being delayed, you are being synchronized. Synchronization takes time because it involves layers you do not consciously manage. Muscles, breath patterns, micro-tensions, emotional reflexes. These must align with the new signal or the system cannot sustain the shift. When alignment begins, the sensation changes again. The resistance no longer feels like a wall. It feels like weight being redistributed. The heaviness migrates, then dissipates. Energy returns not as urgency, but as quiet availability. This is the difference between motivation and readiness. Motivation spikes. Readiness stabilizes. The brake responds only to readiness. You cannot think your way into it. You cannot force your way into it. But you can remain present long enough for the system to complete its recalibration. Presence communicates safety more effectively than any affirmation ever could. The moment you trust the pause stops needing to protect you from yourself. This is not surrender, it is cooperation. And cooperation is how complex systems transition without fracture. You are not losing momentum, you are redistributing it. Let that be enough for now. There is a quieter layer beneath the brake that is rarely felt directly. It is not resistance, it is memory. Not memory as events or images, but as embodied expectation. The system remembers what followed previous expansions. It remembers the cost of being visible, the strain of sustaining new rhythms, the destabilization that came when growth outpaced support. None of this needs to be conscious, to be operative. The body keeps the record. So when a new signal begins to resemble an old threshold, when the pattern echoes a moment where coherence was lost, in the past the brake engages preemptively, not because the future will repeat the past, but because the system cannot yet distinguish between them. This is why the sensation can feel ancient, older than your current circumstances, older than your current goals. It does not belong to the present moment alone. It belongs to a lineage of adaptations designed to prevent fragmentation. The subconscious does not evaluate time linearly. It detects resemblance. Resemblance is enough to activate regulation. You may notice this as disproportionate hesitation, a response that feels larger than the situation warrants. The mind looks for reasons and finds none that satisfy. This mismatch creates confusion. But the confusion is not the problem, it is the clue. The response is not about what is happening now, it is about what the system believes might happen again. This belief is not a thought, it is a posture. The posture manifests as guarded breath, collapsed chest, or a subtle bracing in the abdomen. These micro-adjustments are the break's physical expression. They limit throughput. They reduce signal intensity so the system can remain within known tolerances. You are not meant to override these sensations. Overriding teaches the system that change equals danger. Instead, awareness allows the posture to complete its message. When you notice the bracing without trying to correct it, the body receives confirmation that detection has occurred. It no longer needs to amplify the signal. Amplification stops. The break eases. This is not a technique, it is a recognition event. Recognition tells the system that the observer is present and capable of witnessing discomfort without destabilization. That alone changes the equation. The system begins updating its internal model. It revises what expansion feels like when it is accompanied by awareness rather than pressure. This is how memory releases itself, not through analysis, through new experience. A single moment of expansion without collapse is enough to begin rewriting the pattern. The system does not need proof. It needs evidence of safety. Safety is communicated through continuity, through your ability to remain grounded as the signal strengthens, through the absence of urgency to resolve the sensation immediately. You may notice the break now feels less mechanical and more relational, like a cautious partner waiting to be reassured, not with words but with consistency. Consistency is quiet. It does not announce itself. Each time you remain present through a wave of hesitation, without interpreting it as failure, the system learns. Each time you allow a pause without collapsing into doubt, the threshold shifts slightly. The break recalibrates its sensitivity. This process is subtle. It does not produce dramatic relief. It produces stability, the kind that feels almost unremarkable until you realize the resistance no longer dominates attention. The field responds to this stability, not by delivering outcomes, but by reducing friction. The signal moves more cleanly. The body stops bracing in advance. The mind no longer needs to generate explanations for hesitation. You are not erasing memory. You are updating it. Updating requires repetition, not repetition of action, but repetition of regulated experience. Expansion without overwhelm. Movement without fracture. This is why the work feels slow. It is not slow, it is thorough. You are teaching a system that learned caution for valid reasons, that it is now safe to release some of that vigilance. That teaching happens below language, and once the system learns it, it does not need to be reminded. The break does not vanish, it becomes intelligent. It activates only when necessary, not reflexively. It trusts your capacity to remain coherent through change. This trust is not given, it is earned through presence, and presence is already here. As the break becomes quieter, something else becomes more noticeable. The absence of strain. You may realize that much of what you called effort was never about movement at all. It was about negotiating with an internal system that did not yet feel safe to proceed. When that negotiation pauses, energy returns, but not as urgency, as availability. Availability feels unfamiliar at first. There is no spike, no rush, just a steady openness where tension used to live. The system is no longer spending resources on containment, so attention widens naturally. This is often misinterpreted. Many people mistake calm availability for lack of drive. They expect readiness to feel electric, but electricity implies friction. What you are sensing now is conductivity. Conductivity does not announce itself. It simply allows flow. You may notice that decisions no longer feel heavy, not because they are easy, but because they are no longer loaded with identity risk. The system has stopped associating movement with destabilization. Action becomes procedural again rather than existential. This is a critical shift. When the brake was active, every choice felt like it carried the weight of the future. The system magnified consequence to justify regulation. Now consequence shrinks back to scale. A step is just a step. A signal is just a signal. This does not mean you act impulsively. It means you act without self-surveillance. Self-surveillance was one of the brake's side effects, constantly monitoring whether you were aligned, ready, deserving, prepared. That monitoring consumed more energy than the actions themselves. With the brake easing, the observer relaxes. Awareness remains, but scrutiny dissolves. This is coherence. Coherence is when attention, intention, and physiology stop competing, when they occupy the same rhythm. In that state, movement does not feel like overcoming resistance. It feels like continuation. You may be surprised by how ordinary this feels. No ceremony, no threshold-crossing moment, just a quiet sense that you are no longer arguing with yourself before moving. The quantum field responds differently to this state, not dramatically, subtly. Signals propagate with less distortion. Feedback arrives without friction. You stop interpreting neutral data as rejection or confirmation. It is simply information. This neutrality is stabilizing. Stabilization allows timelines to unfold without constant correction. When the system trusts itself to remain coherent, it no longer clamps down on deviation. Exploration becomes permissible again. Exploration does not mean chaos. It means tolerance for variation. You may notice yourself trying things without attaching meaning to the outcome. That is not detachment. It is resilience. The system has regained confidence in its ability to adapt without collapsing. This confidence does not feel like certainty. It feels like room. Room to adjust. Room to respond. Room to pause without panic. The brake, now quieter, becomes a background function rather than a dominant force. It activates only when signal coherence genuinely drops, not when expansion merely feels unfamiliar. This distinction is crucial. Familiarity is no longer mistaken for safety. Safety is now associated with presence. Presence has replaced prediction. You do not need to anticipate every outcome to move. You trust your capacity to regulate as events unfold. This trust reduces the need for preemptive braking. What once felt like self-sabotage now reveals itself as a system learning a new range of motion. The movements are small at first, almost imperceptible, but they are sustainable. Sustainability is what the system wanted all along, not speed, not intensity, continuity. Continuity allows change to integrate without fracture. It allows the field to respond without turbulence. It allows you to remain yourself as you move through different configurations. Nothing here requires belief. Nothing requires commitment. The system is simply doing what it does best. When given accurate feedback, it is adjusting. You are not pushing forward. You are allowing forward motion to occur without resistance. That is the shift. With the strain gone, another layer comes into view. The subtle habit of anticipation. Even when the brake loosens, the system may still lean forward slightly, waiting for resistance to return. This is not mistrust, it is momentum memory, the echo of a pattern that has not yet fully dissolved. You feel it as readiness without pressure, alert but not tense, attentive but not vigilant. This state is transitional. The system is recalibrating its baseline. It is learning that forward movement no longer requires bracing, that nothing needs to be preemptively managed. Anticipation fades slowly. It cannot be forced to leave. If you try to eliminate it, you reactivate the very vigilance that sustains it. Instead, you let it be present without assigning meaning. You notice the forward lean without correcting posture. You allow the breath to remain natural. the system observes itself being observed. That changes everything. When anticipation is not fed by interpretation, it decays. It has no function without a predicted threat. The body stops preparing for an impact that never arrives. Muscles release their micro-contractions. Attention settles into a wider field. This widening feels like spaciousness, not emptiness. Spaciousness includes sensation without compression. Thoughts can appear without crowding. Emotion can move without pulling the system off balance. In this state, the idea of a break becomes almost abstract, not because it never existed, but because it no longer dominates perception. It has been integrated into a larger system of self-regulation. Integration is quiet. You may notice that you are no longer tracking progress. The need to measure has faded. Measurement was a response to uncertainty. With uncertainty, reduced monitoring becomes unnecessary. This does not mean you are disengaged. It means engagement no longer requires tension. The observer within you is no longer standing guard. It is simply present. Awareness becomes ambient rather than focal. You are not watching for signs. You are receiving information as it arrives. This is a different relationship with the quantum field. Instead of projecting intent and checking for response, you move as part of a continuous exchange. Signal and feedback blur, action and perception interweave. In this exchange, nothing feels like a test. Tests imply judgment. Judgment implies risk. The system no longer operates in that frame. It trusts its ability to adjust in real time. There is no need to lock onto a specific outcome to feel oriented. Orientation comes from internal coherence. You may notice that moments of stillness now feel productive rather than passive. The system continues to integrate even without external movement. Integration does not require constant activity. It requires continuity of presence. This continuity stabilizes timelines, not by selecting one path but by reducing fragmentation across possibilities. When the system is coherent, divergence feels manageable. Choice does not threaten identity. This is why decisions feel lighter, not because they matter less, but because they no longer carry survival weight. The break once amplified consequence to slow you down. Now consequence returns to its natural scale. It becomes information rather than pressure. You respond instead of react. Reaction was the old rhythm. Reaction required speed and defense. Response emerges from space. It includes a pause without hesitation, a pause that feels natural rather than obstructive. This pause is not the break, it is discernment. Discernment does not contract the body, it clarifies attention. The difference is unmistakable once felt. The system recognizes when a pause serves coherence rather than containment. That recognition further refines regulation. The break becomes precise. It intervenes only when necessary, then releases cleanly. No residue, no confusion. You may notice that life appears less dramatic, not dull, simply less charged. Peaks and valleys soften. The system no longer swings between urgency and collapse. This stability is not stagnation, it is equilibrium. Equilibrium allows movement without oscillation. It allows growth without disruption. It allows change to occur at the speed the system can integrate. Nothing needs to be accelerated. Nothing needs to be resisted. The break has done its work. Now the system knows how to move without it. As equilibrium settles, something subtle becomes undeniable. The sense that effort was never the engine. For a long time, movement felt like something you had to initiate, as if reality responded only when pushed. But now, without the internal drag, you begin to notice motion occurring before intention fully forms. Not impulsively, naturally, as if the system is already in conversation with the field. This can feel disorienting at first. You may catch yourself waiting for the familiar cue of struggle before acting. waiting for tension to signal that something is real. But tension does not arrive. Instead, there is a quiet readiness that does not demand attention. This is where many misinterpret the experience. They assume something is missing. That passion has dulled. That urgency has vanished. But urgency was never a reliable indicator of alignment. It was a byproduct of misalignment. Alignment feels quieter. When alignment is present, the system does not need to convince itself to move. The signal propagates because there is no internal interference. You find yourself responding to circumstances rather than preparing for them. Timing feels less strategic and more organic. This is not surrender, it is synchronization. Synchronization does not remove choice. It changes how choice is experienced. Instead of selecting from fear of loss or hope of gain, choice emerges from resonance. You recognize what fits before you analyze why. Recognition precedes explanation. This can feel unfamiliar to a mind accustomed to control. Control relied on prediction. Prediction relied on anxiety. Without anxiety, prediction loses its grip. The system no longer needs to anticipate every variable to feel safe. Safety has moved inward. You may notice that outcomes no longer feel like verdicts. They feel like feedback. Useful, neutral, informative. The emotional charge that once followed results has softened. Success does not inflate. Setbacks do not collapse. The system remains steady. This steadiness is not indifference, it is regulation. Regulation allows you to remain present across fluctuations. The brake once compensated for lack of regulation by limiting movement. Now regulation is internalized. The brake becomes redundant. Redundancy does not mean deletion, it means reliability elsewhere. You are now operating from a system that trusts itself to detect and respond without extreme measures. When adjustment is needed, it happens early and gently. There is no dramatic shutdown, no sudden loss of energy, just a subtle course correction. These corrections feel intuitive, almost invisible. You may not even label them as decisions. They happen as shifts in attention, changes in pacing, slight redirections that do not interrupt flow. Flow is not constant motion. Flow includes pauses, but these pauses no longer feel like barriers. They feel like breath, necessary, rhythmic, supportive. The difference is unmistakable once experienced. You may realize that the question of self-sabotage no longer arises, not because you solved it, but because the system no longer interprets regulation as opposition. The narrative collapses when the sensation it explained dissolves. What remains is simplicity, not simplistic thinking, simple experience. You engage with what is in front of you without layering meaning onto it. The need to decode every internal state fades. You trust the system to signal when attention is required. This trust is not blind. It is earned through repeated experiences of coherence, through noticing that you can move without collapse. That expansion does not require self-violence. That stillness does not threaten progress. In this trust, the observer relaxes further. Awareness remains, but it is no longer searching for anomalies. It rests in the field rather than scanning it. When anomalies do arise, they are met without alarm. The system recognizes them as information rather than warnings. Response replaces reaction automatically. This is maturity at a systemic level, not age, not wisdom narratives, just a system that has learned its own range. The brake is no longer a mystery. It is no longer an adversary. It is simply a function that did its job until it was no longer needed. And now movement continues without commentary. At this stage, something almost imperceptible shifts in how you experience time. Not chronologically, internally. Before, time felt pressurized. Each moment carried the weight of what it should become. Even rest felt conditional, as if it needed to justify itself. by producing clarity or readiness. That pressure was part of the braking system, a way to compress experience so nothing unexpected could emerge. Now time loosens. Moments no longer feel like checkpoints. They feel complete in themselves. The system is no longer scanning the horizon for signs of error or opportunity. It is here, fully, and that presence subtly reorganizes perception. You may notice fewer internal conversations about where you should be, fewer comparisons between the present and an imagined future. The narrative that once ran quietly in the background begins to dissolve, not because you silenced it, but because it no longer serves a regulatory function. The system does not need commentary when coherence is stable. This absence can feel strange. For a while, the mind may look for the old tension, the old urgency, the familiar sense of being behind or ahead. When it does not find it, there may be a brief sense of disorientation, as if something essential is missing. Nothing is missing. Something has been removed. The removal is subtle enough that it does not announce itself. You only notice it by contrast, by realizing that certain thoughts no longer arise automatically, that certain emotional loops no longer complete themselves. This is not suppression. It is irrelevance. The break once made certain patterns necessary. Without it, those patterns lose their purpose. The system does not maintain habits that no longer regulate anything. You may also notice that your relationship with stillness has changed. Stillness no longer feels like waiting. It feels like participation, as if the system continues to interact with the field, even when nothing outward is happening. This is accurate. Interaction does not require movement. It requires receptivity. In a coherent state, receptivity remains active without effort. You are not reaching into the field. You are allowing the field to register you without distortion. Registration is mutual. This mutual registration reduces noise. Signals do not need to be amplified to be detected. Subtle cues become sufficient. You find yourself responding to smaller signals than before, adjusting earlier with less cost. This is efficiency, not optimization. Efficiency born of alignment. When efficiency increases, there is less excess energy to discharge, as anxiety, urgency, or overthinking. The system becomes economical. It uses only what is needed for the moment. Economy brings clarity. Clarity does not arrive as insight or revelation. It arrives as absence of confusion, as fewer competing impulses, as a quiet sense that nothing is pulling you away from yourself. You may notice that identity feels less rigid, not unstable, flexible. You are not defending a version of yourself against the future. You are allowing yourself to be informed by experience without losing continuity. This flexibility was impossible when the brake was active. Rigidity was required to maintain control. Now control is no longer the priority. Coherence is. Coherence allows identity to update without threat. You may find that you speak less internally about what something means. Meaning used to be a way to stabilize experience. Now experience stabilizes itself. Meaning becomes optional. Optional meaning creates freedom. Freedom here does not feel expansive or exhilarating. It feels grounded, like standing on solid ground without needing to check if it will hold. The system trusts its footing. Trust changes how the future is perceived. Instead of a destination that must be reached correctly, it becomes a series of moments that will be met as they arrive. You do not need to rehearse responses. You will have access to them when needed. This confidence is not bravado, it is quiet. Quiet confidence does not announce itself. It simply removes hesitation. Movement happens when it happens. Rest happens when it happens. Neither requires justification. You are no longer negotiating with yourself. This is perhaps the clearest sign that the brake has fully integrated. The internal debate fades. Decisions are not preceded by argument. They emerge, are felt, and are either acted on or not without drama. Drama required resistance. Without resistance, drama has no fuel. What remains is presence with depth, awareness that does not seek resolution, a system that trusts its own capacity to adapt. Adaptation no longer feels like effort. It feels like life doing what it does best when unobstructed. You are not managing this process. You are allowing it to complete. And completion in this context is not an endpoint. It is a state of ongoing balance. Balance that does not need attention to be maintained. What becomes clear now is how little needed to be understood conceptually for this shift to occur. Understanding was never the gate. Stability was. For a long time, the mind assumed that clarity would arrive first and movement would follow. But the system does not work that way. Movement becomes possible when stability is sufficient, and clarity emerges as a side effect. The order was reversed, and the break compensated for that mismatch. Now the order has corrected itself. You may notice that insight arrives after action, not before, or sometimes not at all, and that feels acceptable. The need to narrate experience has softened. You trust that coherence does not require constant explanation. This trust changes how the system relates to uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels like a threat to orientation. It feels like open space, a region where response will form when needed. The system no longer preloads answers. It waits without tension. Waiting without tension is rare and powerful. This state allows the quantum field to respond without distortion. When you are not projecting expectation, the signal you emit is clean. It does not demand confirmation. It does not brace for rejection. It simply exists. Existence is enough. You may notice that synchronicities, when they occur, feel less surprising, not because they are predictable, but because they no longer violate your internal sense of order. The system is not rigid, so alignment does not feel anomalous. Anomalies only exist relative to expectation. With expectation loosened, experience unfolds with less contrast. Highs are less inflated. Lows are less charged. The system remains centered even as conditions vary. This centering is not numbness. It is range. Range allows you to feel without being pulled out of coherence. Emotion moves through rather than lodging in place. Thought arises without hijacking attention. Sensation registers without triggering defense. The break once limited range to preserve stability. Now stability comes from range itself. The system has learned that it can experience variation without losing integrity. Integrity is the key word here. Integrity is not moral, it is structural. Structural integrity means the system can flex without breaking. It can stretch without tearing. It can absorb input without shutting down. This is what the break was protecting all along. Once integrity is internalized, protection becomes unnecessary. You may realize that the idea of release no longer feels accurate. Nothing was released outwardly. No dramatic letting go occurred. Instead, capacity increased. The system grew into what it was previously guarding against. Growth replaced defense. This is why the shift feels so quiet. Defense is loud. Growth is subtle. Growth does not announce itself because it does not need validation. It simply changes what is possible. What is possible now feels less urgent to define. You are no longer scanning the future for reassurance that things will work out. You trust your ability to meet whatever arises with coherence intact. This trust is not a belief. It is a felt sense, a sense that remains even when circumstances fluctuate, even when outcomes are unclear, even when progress is nonlinear. The system does not collapse into old patterns because those patterns no longer regulate anything. They have no job. Without a job, patterns dissolve on their own. They do not need to be challenged or replaced. They simply stop appearing. The mind may notice their absence and briefly search for them, but finds nothing to engage. silence, where there used to be friction. In that silence, awareness becomes more refined. You notice subtler cues, earlier signals, gentle invitations to adjust pace or direction. You respond before imbalance accumulates. This early response prevents the need for heavy regulation. The brake becomes obsolete not because it was defeated, but because it is no longer required. You are now operating from within the system rather than against it. Against it, movement required effort. Within it, movement is distributed. Distributed movement means no single moment carries excessive weight. No decision feels like it will determine everything. The future is no longer concentrated into a single point of action. This diffusion reduces pressure. Pressure was one of the primary triggers for the brake. Without pressure, the system remains open. Openness does not mean vulnerability without boundaries. It means permeability with regulation. You allow information in without being overwhelmed. You allow expression out without overexertion. Exchange becomes balanced. Balance is not static, it is responsive. You may notice that your sense of self feels less like a fixed position and more like a field with continuity but not rigidity. You are present without being confined to a narrative. This field sense aligns naturally with the quantum field, not metaphorically, experientially. Both operate through resonance rather than control. Resonance does not need effort, it requires compatibility. Compatibility arises when internal signals are coherent. You have done nothing to force this coherence. You have simply allowed the system to complete its own recalibration. Completion does not feel final, it feels ongoing. The process continues quietly beneath awareness without supervision. You do not need to manage it. You are no longer its operator, you are its environment. And in that role, nothing is being held back anymore. There is nothing left to resolve here. That realization settles gently without emphasis. You may notice that the impulse to look for a final understanding does not arise. The system does not need closure to feel complete. It needs continuity, and continuity is already present. You are not standing at the end of a process. You are standing inside a stable rhythm. The absence of urgency confirms it. Nothing is pulling you forward. Nothing is holding you back. The field around you feels neutral, receptive, unconcerned with direction. This neutrality is not indifference. It is trust. Trust that movement will occur when it is appropriate. Trust that stillness will remain supportive when movement pauses. You no longer need to evaluate your internal state. Evaluation was necessary when regulation depended on conscious management. Now regulation is distributed. The system knows how to maintain coherence without commentary. This allows attention to soften. Softening does not mean disengaging. It means widening. You are aware without narrowing focus, present without effort. The observer no longer stands apart from experience. Observation happens from within. Within, there is steadiness. The quantum field does not feel distant or abstract here. It feels immediate, not as something you influence, but as something you are already participating in. The distinction between internal and external signal blurs. Exchange happens without intention. This is not a special state. It is an ordinary one, finally unobstructed. Ordinariness is what makes it sustainable. No peak to maintain, no insight to protect, nothing to repeat. The system rests in what it can already do. You may sense a quiet confidence that does not refer to the future. It does not need to. Confidence here is not about what will happen. It is about how you will meet whatever happens. That is enough. The patterns that once interrupted movement no longer require attention. They are inactive, not suppressed. If they ever return, they will be recognized without interpretation. Recognition is sufficient now. Sufficiency replaces effort. Effort was always a signal that something was compensating. Now nothing is compensating. Energy circulates where it is needed and settles when it is not. You do not need to hold on to this state. Holding would reintroduce tension. Let it be transient and continuous at the same time. Let it come and go without naming it. The system will recognize itself in the rhythm and return when appropriate. There is no instruction embedded here, no expectation, just the awareness that the break was never an obstacle. It was a function that ensured coherence until coherence could sustain itself. That function has integrated. Nothing dramatic follows. Life continues, movement continues, stillness continues, and you remain present within all of it without needing to manage the process that carries you forward. This is not an ending. It is not a beginning. It is simply what happens when resistance is no longer mistaken for opposition and regulation is no longer mistaken for failure. You are already here.